She stood outside that door for exactly 9 seconds. 9 seconds to hear enough. 9 seconds to see enough. 9 seconds to watch 2 years of her life disintegrate into something she couldn't even name yet. Not betrayal, not heartbreak, something colder and far more permanent than either. Most women would have collapsed. Most women would have screamed. Vivian Ashcroft was not most women. And by the time she walked away from that door, the most feared crime empire in America was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence was weakness, stay until the very end. Like this video, drop your city in the comments and let me see how far this story travels. Because what Vivian did next, nobody saw coming. The morning started the way all catastrophic mornings do, quietly and with the smell of flowers, white roses. Hundreds of them, imported from somewhere in the south of France at a cost that would have paid a schoolteacher's annual salary 3 times over. They lined every corridor of the Hargrove Cathedral, a landmark so old and so heavy with history that the stone walls seemed to exhale cold air even in the middle of June. Outside, New York moved like it always did, indifferent, loud, already sweating at 8 in the morning. But inside those walls, everything had been arranged to feel like a world that operated by different rules. And it did, just not the rules anyone in the pews understood. Vivian sat at the vanity in her private suite on the 2nd floor, watching her reflection with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned very early that showing too much on her face was a form of vulnerability she couldn't afford. Her dark hair had been arranged by a stylist who'd flown in from Milan. The gown, custom, architectural, the kind of dress that made people stop mid-sentence, sat against her body like it had been grown there rather than sewn. On her left hand, a diamond that Lucien had placed there 11 months ago caught the morning light and threw it across the ceiling in fragments. She looked, by every measurable standard, like a woman who had everything. Her maid of honor, Dara, was talking. She had been talking for 20 minutes, filling the silence with the cheerful, anxious energy that bridesmaids deploy when they sense something they can't quite name. Vivian caught words here and there. Flowers, schedule. The senator's wife had arrived early. The caterer needed a final confirmation on the seafood course. Viv. Dara crouched beside her, catching her eyes in the mirror. You okay? I'm fine. You're doing the thing. What thing? The thing where your face goes completely blank and you look like you're solving a math problem nobody else can see. Vivian allowed herself a small, controlled smile. I'm just thinking. It's your wedding day. You're not supposed to think. You're supposed to feel. I feel fine. Dara studied her for another moment, then straightened, clearly deciding that whatever was happening inside Vivian Ashcroft's head was above her clearance level. She went back to arranging things, because that was what Dara did when she was nervous. She arranged things. Vivian turned back to her reflection. She did not feel fine. She felt something that had no clean word attached to it, a vibration in her sternum, a low, persistent hum that had been with her since she woke up at 5 that morning from a dream she couldn't remember, but that had left her sitting upright in the dark with her hands pressed flat against the mattress. She'd told herself it was nerves, pre-wedding anxiety, entirely normal for a woman about to formalize the most significant legal and financial union in her family's history. That was how she'd been trained to think about it. Significant, strategic, the correct next move. Her father, Elliot Ashcroft, had used those exact words when she first introduced Lucien Moretti to the family 14 months ago. Significant. Strategic. The Ashcroft family controlled one of the largest private investment portfolios in the northeastern United States. The Moretti name carried weight in 6 industries across 4 countries. Legitimate industries, or what appeared to be legitimate industries to anyone who didn't know where to look. The marriage made sense on paper in the way that very few things in Vivian's life had ever made sense on paper. She had not let herself think too hard about what it felt like. That was the thing about Vivian Ashcroft that people often missed when they looked at her. The composure, the precision, the way she could walk into a boardroom full of men twice her age and within 40 minutes have them restructuring their own arguments to agree with hers. They saw control and assumed it came easily. They didn't see the discipline underneath it. The years of learning to compact her own emotional responses into something small and manageable and storable, to be dealt with later, in private, if at all. She picked up her bouquet, set it down again. The heirloom. It had come to her at breakfast, delivered by her aunt with a quiet, private ceremony. A brooch that had belonged to Vivian's grandmother, a woman who had survived things that Vivian had only heard about in careful, edited versions. Her aunt had pressed it into her hand and said, "Give it to your husband this morning, before the ceremony. It's what the women in this family do." It was a small thing, gold, with a blue stone at the center. Nothing that would mean anything to anyone outside the family. But the tradition mattered, and Vivian, who questioned almost every other tradition that had ever been placed in front of her, had found herself holding on to this one. She told Dara she'd be back in 5 minutes. The corridor outside her suite was empty. Most of the cathedral's staff and guests were concentrated on the ground floor, and the second-floor hallway had the particular hushed quality of spaces that are waiting to be used. Her heels were quiet against the runner carpet. Through the tall windows at the end of the hall, she could see the street below. The black cars lined up. A small crowd of spectators gathered behind a rope barrier, hoping to catch a glimpse of something worth seeing. Lucienne's private suite was at the far end of the corridor. She was perhaps 20 feet away when she heard it. Laughter. Not the restrained, appropriate laughter of men preparing for a public ceremony. Something looser, more private. The specific frequency of laughter that people produce when they believe no one is listening. The door was not fully closed. She stopped. Later, much later, she would try to identify the exact moment the decision was made, the moment she chose to move closer instead of announcing herself or turning around. She never found a clean answer. It was less a decision than a reflex, some animal part of her responding to something in that laughter that the rational part of her brain hadn't yet processed. She moved to the doorway, kept her body against the wall, looked through the gap. Lucien Moretti was not a man who occupied a room. He consumed it. 6'2", lean and precisely built, with the kind of face that read as handsome in photographs and dangerously compelling in person. The kind of face that had a habit of making people trust him before they understood why. He was wearing his wedding tuxedo. It fit him the way expensive things always fit men who have never had to worry about the cost of expensive things. He was kissing Isabella Romano with both hands. Vivian had met Isabella 3 times, formally, at events where Isabella had been introduced as a financial consultant the Moretti family retained for specific European accounts. She was beautiful in the particular way of women who understand beauty as a professional asset. Assembled, precise, never accidentally anything. Dark hair. A mouth that seemed permanently arranged in a private amusement. She and Vivian had exchanged professional courtesies and nothing else, because there had seemed to be nothing else to exchange. Now Isabella's hands were against Lucien's chest, and she was laughing softly against his mouth. And Lucien's hands were in her hair, and the scene had the comfortable, practiced quality of something that had happened many times before and expected to happen many times again. "You're going to wrinkle the jacket," Isabella said. "I'll change my jacket." "You'll be late." "I'm never late." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has spent his entire life making other things adjust to his schedule. He pulled back slightly, looked at her in that direct, assessing way of his. "Stop worrying." "I'm not worried. I'm curious." She tilted her head. "Does she know? Anything?" The pause before he answered was very short, but Vivian had spent 2 years studying the architecture of Lucien Moretti's pauses, and she felt this one in her back teeth. "She knows what I needed her to know." Isabella made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters." He straightened his lapels, checking his reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. "Vivian is exceptional at her work. She's careful, she's thorough, and she believes in the structures she builds. That's exactly what I needed." "And the wedding?" "The wedding is a contract executed in public. It gives me legitimacy with her father's political network. It gives me legal access to the Ashcroft capital structure. It gives me a wife who is respected, credible, and completely committed to believing the best about the man she married." He turned from the mirror, looked at Isabella with something that Vivian, watching from the doorway, could not fully read. Affection, certainly, but also the particular satisfaction of a man contemplating a game that has gone exactly as planned. "Once the merger with Ashcroft Capital is legally complete, I have everything I need from her." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "And me?" You, Lucien said, and his voice dropped into something quieter, more deliberate, have always been the one I actually chose. Vivian's right hand moved to her pocket before her brain issued the instruction. Her phone was recording before she finished exhaling. She held it steady. The angle through the door gap was imperfect. She could see Lucien's profile, Isabella's face, the fireplace behind them, the full-length mirror that reflected the whole room back at her like a second witness. The audio was clear. The suite had been designed with thick walls and good acoustics, the kind of investment in quality that powerful men make in spaces where they intend to have private conversations. The irony of that was not lost on her. Merger closes in 90 days, Lucien was saying. By then, the offshore trust restructuring will be finalized. The congressional contacts your brother arranged will be activated. And by December, the federal task force that's been sniffing around the Millbrook accounts will find exactly what I've arranged for them to find, which is nothing. You're certain about the Ashcroft lawyers? Vivian handled that herself. She spent 8 weeks building the legal architecture for the Cayman restructure. She's brilliant. A beat. She has no idea what she built. Vivian's throat closed. She had spent 8 weeks on that structure. 8 weeks of meticulous, exhausting, intellectually demanding work that she had believed was legitimate consolidation of cross-border investment vehicles. She had been proud of it. She had presented it to Lucien as a demonstration of what she could contribute not just as a wife, but as a genuine professional partner in the management of the family's global holdings. She had built the cage. She just hadn't known whose name was on the door. Her hand was not shaking. She registered that fact with the distant clinical portion of her mind that was still operating independently of the thing that had just broken open somewhere below her sternum. Her hand was completely steady. The phone continued recording. Isabella was speaking again. Something about the Romano family's concerns. A captain named Vitelli, who had been asking questions about the Millbrook accounts. But the words were reaching Vivian through something that felt like water, present but distorted, the meaning arriving slightly after the sound. She had enough. She had more than enough. She pulled back from the door, pressed herself against the corridor wall, stood there for exactly 9 seconds. She counted them, not consciously, but afterward she would remember each one with the strange clarity that traumatic moments sometimes produce. And in those 9 seconds, she experienced something that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately. It was not rage. Rage was hot, and this was cold. It was not grief, or not only grief. Grief was passive, and this was the opposite of passive. It was more like the specific, focused sensation of a very large and very complex piece of machinery clicking into a new configuration, heavy, irreversible, and somehow inevitable, as though it had always been going to happen this way, and her body had known before her mind caught up. She walked back to her suite. Dara was still arranging things. She looked up when Vivian came in, registered something in her face, and started to speak. "Don't," Vivian said, quietly, without anger. Dara stopped. Vivian sat down at the vanity, looked at her reflection. She uploaded the video to the encrypted cloud server she maintained, a professional habit, redundant backup systems for everything, one of the disciplines she'd developed in her years of handling sensitive legal work, and set 3 separate access keys on it, each stored in a different location. Then she opened a different application on her phone, one that had been sitting dormant for 7 months since the night she'd created it. As what she'd told herself was a pure hypothetical and intellectual exercise, the kind of contingency planning that a certain type of mind engages in, not because it believes the contingency will be needed, but because the absence of a plan produces a low-grade anxiety that interferes with sleep. She had built it in 6 days. She had never expected to use it. She looked at the activation screen for a long moment. She thought about her grandmother's brooch, still in her hand. She thought about 8 weeks of work she had given in good faith to a structure she now understood had been designed to launder money across 4 jurisdictions and insulate the people who moved it from any legal consequence. She thought about Isabella Romano's voice saying, "Does she know anything?" with the comfortable contempt of someone who has already decided the answer is no. She pressed the button. The cascade began immediately, silently, automatically. A series of encrypted file packages, each addressed to a different recipient, each set to release at a specific trigger time. Federal investigators. 3 separate financial crime units across 2 countries, 4 major news organizations whose investigative desks had been quietly building Moretti-adjacent cases for years without the specific documentation they needed. And finally, 7 recipients whose names Vivian had assembled over months of careful, undetected research. The heads of families whose financial dealings intersected with Lucien's in ways that Lucien had not been honest with them about. The trigger was the moment the wedding ceremony officially began. She set her phone face down on the vanity. She picked up her bouquet. She looked at herself one more time in the mirror. The gown, the hair, the diamond on her hand. And in her expression, there was nothing that any person watching would have been able to read as anything other than the composure of a woman prepared to walk toward her future. Dara was watching her from across the room with an expression that occupied the space between concern and something much closer to fear. "Viv," she said. Her voice had gone careful. "What did you do?" Vivian stood, smoothed the front of her gown, picked up the brooch from the vanity and held it in her left hand, the blue stone pressed against her palm. "I handled something," she said. "That's not—" "I need you to stay in this room until I send for you." She met Dara's eyes. "Whatever you hear, whatever happens, stay in this room." "Vivian?" "Dara." The word landed with the quiet finality of a door closing. "Please." Dara said nothing else. Vivian walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. Below her, she could hear the low collective murmur of 400 guests settling into their seats. Senators, judges, executives, diplomats, crime bosses wearing the faces of legitimate men. She could hear the faint music beginning, the processional arrangement that had been selected months ago at a planning meeting where she'd sat across from Lucien and believed, with the precision and thoroughness she applied to everything, that she understood what she was building. She had understood. She'd just been missing the most important variable. She let out one slow breath. And then Vivian Ashcroft, the woman everyone in that cathedral believed they knew, walked down the corridor toward the stairs. The clock had already started. And nobody inside those walls had any idea that the next 20 minutes would be the last 20 minutes the Moretti Empire would ever have. The stairs were marble, and Vivian's heels found each step with a precision that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with control. Below her, the murmur of 400 people filled the cathedral's ground floor like water filling a basin. Slow, inevitable, rising. She could feel it through the banister when she touched it. The vibration of all those bodies, all that money, all that carefully constructed respectability gathered in one place to witness something that none of them understood. She reached the bottom of the stairs and paused in the antechamber, a vaulted space off the main hall where the wedding coordinator, a thin woman named Petra, who communicated primarily through a headset and a clipboard, was waiting with the focused anxiety of someone who had been managing other people's crises for 20 years and still hadn't developed immunity to them. "Mrs. Ashcroft. Miss Ashcroft. We're 4 minutes behind schedule." Petra's eyes moved over her with the professional efficiency of a woman checking for visible damage. "Are you ready?" "Yes." "Your father is already at the entrance. The processional music starts in 3 minutes." "I know." Petra opened her mouth, closed it, made a small notation on her clipboard. Something in Vivian's voice had apparently communicated that further logistical updates were unwelcome. She touched her headset and murmured something into it and stepped aside. Vivian walked through the antechamber toward the main entrance corridor where her father was waiting. Elliot Ashcroft was 71 years old, built like a man who had once been physically imposing and had since settled into something more precisely maintained. Silver hair. A suit that cost more than most cars. He had the particular bearing of men who have spent decades being the most important person in every room they entered. Not aggressive, not performative, just absolutely certain, in the way of water that knows it will eventually find every crack in the stone. He looked at her when she appeared. Really looked at her, the way he rarely did. Not assessing her presentation or calibrating her usefulness to a situation, but looking at his daughter with the unguarded attention of a man who still, despite everything, loved her in the blunt and imperfect way he was capable of. "You look like your mother," he said. It was possibly the most emotionally generous thing he had said to her in 10 years. "Dad!" She stopped in front of him, looked up at him. "Whatever happens today, I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." The line between his eyebrows deepened. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. Vivian. His voice dropped. The warmth was still there, but something else moved underneath it now. The old instinct of a man who had built and protected an empire of his own and had learned to hear the specific register of a warning even when it came wrapped in calm. Is there something I need to know before we walk in there? She held his gaze. In his eyes, she could see the question he wasn't quite asking. The one about Lucian, about the speed of the engagement, about the 2 or 3 moments over the past year when he had looked at his daughter with that same careful attention and seen something in her face that she hadn't confirmed or denied. You'll know everything soon, she said. I promise you that. He studied her for 3 seconds. Then he offered his arm. She took it. The doors opened. The music shifted. 400 people rose. Vivian walked into the cathedral on her father's arm and looked straight ahead, and her face held the composed, luminous expression of a woman moving toward the life she had chosen, and not one person in those pews saw anything other than what she intended them to see. Lucian was at the altar. She found him immediately. He was the kind of man you found immediately in any room. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him, and one of the things she had later understood was not accidental, was in fact as carefully cultivated as everything else about him. He was watching her with that expression he had, the one that read as profound attention, as though she were the only thing in the room worth looking at. She had spent a year believing that expression was genuine. She understood now that it was a tool, and that tools did not stop being effective simply because you knew what they were. She kept her eyes on him and kept walking. Beside her, her father's arm was rigid, in a way it hadn't been when they stepped in. He had felt something shift in her, or perhaps he had looked at Lucian and seen something he hadn't let himself see before. Or perhaps the years of operating in rooms full of dangerous men had given him a sensitivity to the specific texture of a moment that was about to change direction catastrophically. He didn't say anything. He walked her to the altar. He placed her hand in Lucian's. Lucian's fingers closed around hers. Warm, firm, the practiced grip of a man who had learned that a convincing touch was worth more than almost anything else in the currency of human trust. He looked down at her with that expression and said very quietly, just for her, "You're extraordinary." Vivian said nothing. His eyes moved over her face, reading it the way he always did, with that intelligence that was one of the things she had genuinely admired about him. The ability to process information quickly, to detect subtle signals, to understand what a person was communicating beneath the surface of what they were saying. For one fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. Then it was gone, replaced by the performance of a man fully in command of his occasion, and he turned with her to face the officiant, and the ceremony began. The officiant's voice filled the cathedral with the practiced cadences of formal language. Vivian heard the words the way you hear music in a foreign language. The sound was present and coherent, but the meaning slid past without catching. She was watching the screens. 4 large projection screens had been installed for the reception portion of the evening. A slideshow of photographs was supposed to begin after the vows, a carefully curated visual narrative of Vivian and Lucian's relationship constructed by a firm that specialized in exactly this kind of thing. The screens were dark now, waiting. In her left hand, concealed in the fold of her bouquet, her phone showed the time. The ceremony had officially begun 40 seconds ago, which meant the cascade had begun 40 seconds ago. Across the city, encrypted files were opening. In Washington, in 2 field offices she would not name aloud even to herself, agents who had received anonymous tips over the preceding months were now receiving the documentation that gave those tips weight and specificity and prosecutorial teeth. In 3 separate newsrooms, editors had just received packages that their investigative reporters had been waiting years for. And in 7 private residences and offices belonging to men whose names appeared in those documents in ways Lucian had never disclosed to them, phones were beginning to ring. She felt the specific calm of a person who has released something into the world that cannot be recalled. Lucian was speaking. His vows. She became aware of this and redirected her attention to his face and found that he was looking at her with something that was, and this was the part she would have the most difficulty processing afterward, real. Not entirely performed. There was something underneath the words that was genuine, or had been genuine once, or was the ghost of something genuine that he had long since decided to sacrifice for other priorities. She found she didn't care. That was what surprised her. Not the anger, not the cold focus, but the sudden, clean absence of the feeling she'd spent a year building around this man. Like a structure that looks intact until you remove one crucial piece and discover that nothing was actually holding anything together. The officiant turned to her. "Vivian Catherine Ashcroft, do you take this man?" "I have something to say first." Her voice came out of her completely controlled, at exactly the volume needed to reach every corner of the cathedral without any technical assistance. 400 people went silent in the way that crowds go silent when something has happened that they haven't yet classified. The pre-panic stillness, the collective held breath. Lucien's hand tightened on hers. "Vivian." His voice was very quiet. Just her name, but inside it was the full weight of a man who was used to containing situations with a single word. She looked at him. "I have one final wedding gift," she said, "for everyone here." She turned toward the wall where the main projection control panel was located. The operator, a young man who had been hired by the event company and who had this morning received a message from what appeared to be the bride's personal assistant with updated instructions for the ceremony, was looking at her, waiting. She gave him the signal they had agreed on. The screens came alive. The video was not long. 43 seconds of footage shot through a door gap in imperfect light, but the audio was clear and the faces were clear, and the words, "The wedding is only business. She'll become another beautiful memory. You've always been the woman I actually chose," landed in the cathedral's acoustics with the specific quality of words that cannot be unheard. Vivienne watched the screens. She did not watch Lucien. She did not watch the crowd. She watched the images play out with the same focused attention she gave to every piece of work she had ever produced, checking for quality, checking for impact, confirming that what she had built was doing what she had built it to do. The gasps came in a wave, one section of the cathedral to the next, as each cluster of people processed what they were seeing. She heard a woman's voice say, "Oh my God," in a tone that was completely stripped of performance. She heard a chair scrape. She heard, from somewhere to her right, a sharp intake of breath followed by a low, profane syllable in what might have been Italian. On her left, she heard her father stop breathing. The video ended. The second file opened automatically. This one was not a video. It was a visual representation of data, financial data, transaction records, corporate structures rendered in clean graphics that someone with no financial training could follow and that someone with financial training would find devastating. Account numbers, transfer dates, shell company names and their actual beneficial owners. The graphic moved through the Moretti financial architecture like a guided tour, pausing on each structure long enough for comprehension to settle. Vivienne had built several of those structures herself. She had understood what she was looking at the moment she pulled the files 3 hours ago. The real files, the ones behind the ones she'd been shown, the ones accessible through the secondary credential set she had quietly obtained 6 weeks into the engagement from a system she was supposed to only have limited access to. She had opened them, understood them completely in the way that only the person who built part of the architecture could understand them, and had added her own documentation to the package. She felt Lucien move, not toward her, away from her and toward the projection equipment, with the smooth lateral movement of a man who has spent years knowing exactly which direction the exit is. One of his bodyguards, positioned near the side entrance in the role of a groomsman, moved with him, putting a hand inside his jacket. "Don't." The word came from the center aisle, and it came with a badge and a weapon, and it was followed by 8 more agents who had been in the cathedral for 3 hours wearing guest-appropriate clothing and the expressions of people watching a wedding. Everything happened very fast after that. It happens that way. The long constructed silence, the controlled detonation, and then suddenly everything is moving at once, and the order that people have been trusting dissolves into its individual components. Vivienne had known it would happen this way. She had modeled it. She had estimated that there would be between 90 seconds and 3 minutes of clean exposure before the situation became physically chaotic, and she had planned to be nowhere near the center of it when it did. She was not nowhere near the center of it. She was exactly at the center of it because she had not fully modeled for the one thing that could not be modeled. The specific targeted fury of a man whose entire constructed world has just been dismantled publicly by the one person he had been absolutely certain would never do it. Lucien turned back to her. His face was different, Not the mask she'd watched him wear for 2 years, and not the private face she'd seen through the door gap. Something else entirely. Something underneath both of those, raw and stripped and genuinely enraged in a way that communicated that whatever calculation he was running, the outcome was not surrender. "You have no idea," he said, "what you've just started." "I know exactly what I've started." She met his eyes without flinching. "That's the difference between us. People are going to get hurt because of what you did today. People were already getting hurt because of what you did." She paused. "For years." He took one step toward her, and the nearest federal agent moved, and two of Lucien's remaining loyal bodyguards moved in response, and for a moment the space between Vivienne and Lucien was a loaded thing, dense with competing physics, and she held her ground in it because she had decided before she walked into this cathedral that she was not going to move backward for this man again. From the crowd, something unexpected happened. A voice. Male, accented, furious. Coming from the left side of the cathedral where several rows had been occupied by men whose names did not appear on any public guest list, but who had connections to Lucien that went back 15 years and further. One of them was standing. A heavy-set man in his 60s with a face that had been in the sun for decades and a stillness about him that communicated authority even in the middle of chaos. "The Ortega accounts," the man said. His voice carried. Those were the Ortega accounts on that screen. Lucien turned toward him. The smoothness came back into his expression the way oil comes back to the surface of water. Automatic, practiced, impossible to entirely suppress. "Carlo, those accounts were supposed to be... You told me those accounts were..." The man stopped. His jaw worked. Around him, two other men had also risen, and their expressions had the particular quality of men who have survived long enough in dangerous professions by developing an exquisite sensitivity to betrayal. "You've been moving our money. This isn't the time. You've been moving our money." Louder now. Flat. "Into your own structures. That is a federal agent's lie. That is fabricated. Those are my account numbers." The man took one step into the aisle. "I know my own account numbers, Lucien. I've been watching those numbers for 22 years. Three things happened simultaneously. Another section of the financial data appeared on the screens. A second cascade, the backup package Vivienne had prepared for exactly this contingency. The one that contained the internal Moretti communications about how to characterize the account transfers to the other families if questions arose. It was 3 years of memos. It was specific, devastating, and clearly authenticated. The heavy-set man named Carlo looked at the screen. His face went through 4 distinct expressions in the space of 2 seconds. And from outside the cathedral, very clearly through the stone walls, came the sound of helicopters. Vivienne had not arranged the helicopters. That was federal. That was something the federal operation had brought on its own timeline, their own logistics, their own escalation protocols triggered by the simultaneous receipt of documentation across multiple field offices. She had given them the information. She had not given them the schedule. They had made their own schedule. It was a strange sensation, watching something you built go beyond the parameters you set for it, watching the architecture you designed accept forces you hadn't planned for and hold anyway. The cathedral was not panicking yet, but it was the moment before panic. That specific human frequency of 400 people simultaneously recalculating their own exposure and proximity to something they had just realized was much larger and much more dangerous than a wedding gone wrong. Lucien's eyes found hers across the chaos. She had expected rage. She had modeled rage. She had prepared for threats, for the specific register of a man who uses danger as a language. What she had not prepared for, what she could not have prepared for, was the thing she saw instead. He looked at her with something she could only describe as recognition, as though, in the wreckage of everything he had built and lost in the past 7 minutes, he had arrived at a specific clarity about who she was that he had never allowed himself before. As though the woman he had designed as a useful acquisition had just introduced herself as someone else entirely, someone he should have met properly a long time ago. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the nearest agent reached him, and from the left side of the cathedral, the heavy-set man named Carlo Ortega said something in a language that wasn't English to the men around him, and those men began moving, and the direction they were moving was not toward the exit. It was toward Lucien. Vivienne took 3 steps backward, then 4. putting the altar between herself and the geometric center of what was about to happen. Her heels finding the marble by instinct, her eyes mapping the space the way she had mapped it 3 weeks ago, when she'd come here alone and walked every exit and measured every sightline and decided where she would be standing when the moment arrived. She was in the right place. She was exactly where she'd planned to be, and she was completely, viscerally unprepared for the sound of the first gunshot, which came not from the direction of the federal agents or the Ortega men or Lucian's bodyguards, but from directly behind her, from a position she had not mapped, from a shooter she had not accounted for. A small, controlled crack of sound that hit the stone ceiling and brought down a shower of plaster and sent 400 people from the moment before panic directly into panic itself, all at once, like a wave breaking. Vivienne dropped to one knee behind the altar. Her bouquet hit the floor. The blue brooch rolled out of her palm and skittered across the marble and disappeared into the chaos. Around her, the cathedral became a single, enormous sound. Voices, movement, the specific acoustics of a confined space full of frightened people. And through it she could hear the federal agents calling to each other in the clipped, functional language of people executing a plan under pressure. And somewhere to her left she could hear Carlo Ortega's voice, still going, patient and implacable, and somehow audible even through everything else, saying Lucian's name like it was the last thing he intended to say. She pressed her back against the altar, pulled out her phone, checked the status of the cascade. All packages delivered. All triggers activated. All recipients confirmed. She had done what she came to do. The problem was that she was still inside the building where she had done it, and the building had just become the most dangerous room in New York City. And the one exit she had designated as primary was on the other side of 40 feet of open floor that was currently occupied by federal agents, panicking guests, and at least 3 men whose loyalties she could not now predict with any confidence. She looked at the exit. She looked at the distance. She looked at the chaos between her and it. And then, from directly above her, through the stone and the noise and the helicopter rotors, her phone lit up with a message from a number she did not recognize, containing 4 words that told her, with absolute certainty, that someone else had been watching this entire morning unfold from a position she had not known existed, someone who knew things about her plan that she had told no one. Someone who had either been protecting her from a distance or had been waiting for this exact moment to make themselves known. The 4 words were, "Don't use that exit." Vivienne stared at those 4 words for exactly 2 seconds. Don't use that exit. The number had no contact name attached to it, no area code she recognized. The message had arrived at the precise moment she had turned to look at the exit, which meant whoever sent it could see her, which meant there was a sightline into this cathedral from somewhere she hadn't mapped, which meant her spatial model of this situation, the one she had spent 3 weeks constructing with the same methodical attention she gave to every structure she built, had a hole in it the size of a person. She pressed herself flatter against the altar stone and looked up. The cathedral's upper gallery ran along the interior perimeter, a narrow walkway behind the decorative columns, accessible from a staircase near the vestibule that she had noted during her preparatory visit and dismissed as architecturally significant but operationally irrelevant. She had dismissed it because it was a dead end. No exterior exit. Nowhere to go from up there except back down. She had been wrong about what mattered. A figure was in the gallery. Left side, 3rd column from the front. Standing back far enough from the railing to avoid easy sightline from the floor, but she could see the outline. The specific stillness of a person who was watching rather than reacting, not panicking with everyone else, not moving toward any exit, just watching her. Her phone lit again. Same number. Vestibule closet. Northeast corner. Key is taped under the 2nd shelf. She had 2 choices, and about 45 seconds before the chaos on the floor reorganized itself into something with direction. The federal agents were still calling to each other, still managing the crowd surge toward the main doors. Carlo Ortega's men had reached Lucien, or nearly reached him. She couldn't see clearly anymore. The view was blocked by bodies moving in every direction. Somewhere in that mass of movement was Lucien's voice, still controlled, still working the situation with the professional composure of a man who had been in worse physical danger and survived it through sheer force of personality. She did not take the primary exit. She moved along the base of the wall, using the crowd surge as cover, keeping her body low and her gown gathered in one hand so it didn't drag. The marble floor was cold even through her shoes. Her knees were functioning, but her hands had gone very cold, the specific cold of blood redirecting itself away from extremities in response to sustained adrenaline, and she noted this the way she noted everything, clinically cataloging it as a physical datum that required no emotional response. The vestibule was off the main entrance corridor, separated from the cathedral's interior by a heavy door that was currently propped open by the weight of guests who had moved into it seeking an exit path. She pushed through them with the quiet, focused efficiency of a woman who knew exactly where she was going, which meant people moved out of her way without being asked, because certainty communicates itself physically, and crowds respond to it before they understand why. Northeast corner. The closet was unmarked. A maintenance door painted the same stone gray as the surrounding wall. She found it. She found the shelf. She found the key exactly where the message had said it would be, taped to the underside of the second shelf with ordinary clear tape, the kind of mundane physical detail that made the whole thing more disorienting, not less. Whoever had done this had planned it quietly and practically and without drama. The key opened a door in the back of the closet that she had not known existed. Behind it was a narrow service corridor, the kind that runs through old buildings like a secondary nervous system, maintenance access, utility runs, passages that the building's original architects included for practical reasons, and that subsequent generations of occupants forgot about. It was cold and poorly lit, and it smelled of stone and old plumbing, and it ran perpendicular to the main structure in a direction that, if her sense of orientation was correct, would bring her out on the building's north side. She moved into it. The door closed behind her. The noise of the cathedral became muffled immediately. Reduced to a low-frequency vibration she felt more than heard. The sound of a catastrophe in progress filtered through 2 feet of old stone. In the sudden relative quiet, her own breathing was very loud. She became aware of how fast it was and slowed it down deliberately. 3 counts in, 4 counts out, a technique she'd developed in law school during a period she didn't think about often. Halfway down the corridor, someone was waiting for her. She stopped. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, in the specific posture of a person who has been waiting long enough to get comfortable about it. Early 40s, medium height, compact build, the kind of face that was professionally forgettable. No single feature that would anchor in memory, everything arranged into an aggregate of unremarkable. He was wearing a dark suit that could have been a guest's or could have been anything else. His eyes, when they found hers, were pale and very direct. "You've got about 4 minutes before they lock down the perimeter exits," he said. His voice was flat, Midwestern, efficient, so I'll keep this short. "Who are you?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand, and she delivered it with the full weight of a woman who had just dismantled a criminal empire and was not in the mood for ambiguity. "My name doesn't matter right now," he pushed off the wall. "What matters is that the cascade you activated this morning only released 60% of what you intended." She felt the floor shift under her. Not physically. The stone was perfectly solid, but the architecture of her certainty, the thing she had been standing on for the past hour, moved in a way that was distinct and deeply wrong. "That's not possible," she said. "The federal package went through clean. The news organizations received everything. The rival family documentation was complete." He paused. "The banking records that were supposed to go to the financial crime units in Frankfurt and Singapore were intercepted approximately 11 minutes before the cascade triggered. The interception was clean, no trace left in your system. You would have had no way of knowing." She said nothing. She was running the architecture in her head, going back through every node of the system she had built, looking for the place where what he was describing could have happened. "Who intercepted them?" she said. "That's the part you're not going to like." "Tell me anyway." He looked at her steadily. "Marcus Webb." The name landed with the specific weight of something she'd been certain was impossible. Marcus Webb was her contact, her inside contact, the one she had spent 4 months carefully, quietly cultivating through a series of intermediary communications that she had designed to be untraceable. Marcus Webb was a senior compliance officer at Hartley Partners, the legitimate financial firm that handled the Moretti organization's above-ground banking relationships. He had approached her, or appeared to approach her, 18 months ago at a conference, with the tentative, frightened manner of a man who had seen things he couldn't unsee and didn't know what to do about them. She had spent 4 months assessing him, testing him, running him through the same evaluation framework she applied to every significant variable in every significant structure she built. She had concluded, with a confidence she almost never allowed herself, that he was genuine, that his fear was real, that his information was accurate and his motives were what he said they were. She had given him a specific role in the cascade architecture. Not the whole picture. She never gave anyone the whole picture, but a specific, essential node. The Frankfurt and Singapore documentation had moved through his access credentials because it was the cleanest pathway and because she trusted him. When, she said. He's been feeding information back to Lucien for at least 6 months. The man in the corridor watched her face as he said it. She noticed him watching and didn't give him anything to work with. Possibly longer. We're still mapping the timeline. We. She caught the word. Who is we? People who have been watching the Moretti organization longer than you have, and who had a significant professional interest in what you were building. He paused. We didn't interfere with your plan because your plan was better than ours. More elegant, more complete. But we also didn't know about Webb until 3 days ago, and by then the cascade was already armed, and we couldn't reach you without alerting Lucien's surveillance. So you taped a key under a shelf. We've been operating in this building for 6 days. We had limited options and very specific timing constraints. She processed this. The corridor was cold, and the noise from the cathedral, even muffled, had changed quality. Less chaotic movement, more concentrated, the sound of a situation being contained. The federal agents were establishing control, which meant the window for anything else was closing. What does Lucien know? She said. Specifically, what did Webb tell him? The man in the corridor took a breath. It was the first physical indication she had seen from him that what he was about to say required preparation. He knows about the encrypted server. He knows the general architecture of the cascade. He knows you recorded the video in the suite. He stopped. And he knows about your father's secondary accounts. The ones Elliot Ashcroft moved offshore 3 years ago without disclosing them to the Ashcroft Capital Board. Everything in Vivian's body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the corridor temperature, her father's accounts. She knew about them, had known for 2 years, discovered them accidentally in the course of work she'd been doing on the family's legitimate tax structure, and had said nothing. Had put the knowledge in the same mental compartment where she stored other things that required careful handling and hadn't yet determined how to handle. Her father was not a criminal in the way Lucien was a criminal. The accounts were aggressive, probably illegal in 3 jurisdictions, the kind of thing that powerful men had been doing quietly for generations, and that had remained quiet because no one had incentive to make them loud. Lucien had incentive now. If those accounts become part of the federal investigation, she started. Your father faces prosecution? Yes. And Lucien's lawyers have already been in contact with a federal prosecutor in the Southern District with what they're characterizing as a cooperative disclosure offer. The man's voice stayed flat. The disclosure implicates Elliot Ashcroft in knowing facilitation of cross-border financial crimes, specifically 3 transactions in 2021 that moved through structures your father had undisclosed ownership interests in. That's a lie. It's partially a lie. The 2021 transactions are real. Your father's awareness of their nature is where it becomes complicated. She stood very still in the maintenance corridor in her wedding gown, with the sound of federal agents reorganizing a crime scene 40 feet away through 2 feet of stone, and she did the thing she always did when a structure collapsed unexpectedly. She went back to first principles. Not what she had built. What was true. What was actually verifiably, inarguably true, and what could be derived from it. Her father had those accounts. That was true. Lucien knew about them. That was true. Lucien's team had already moved to weaponize them. That was apparently true, which meant that the cascade she had activated, the things she had built with such precision and activated with such certainty, had not destroyed the Moretti organization cleanly. It had wounded it, perhaps fatally, but in the process it had exposed her father to a counterattack that she had not prepared for because she had not known the exposure existed. She had built the perfect trap, and someone had found the one unprotected angle. My father, she said, where is he right now? Still in the cathedral. Federal agents have asked all guests to remain. Is he being detained? Not yet. But there are 2 men from the Southern District office in the cathedral who are not there in a general capacity. They have a specific interest in speaking with Elliot Ashcroft before he leaves the building. She was already moving, back the way she'd come, toward the closet door, recalculating the path that would get her from the service corridor to the main floor in the fastest possible time without using the primary exit that someone had known to tell her to avoid. "You can't go back in there," the man said behind her. He was following. "There are federal agents coordinating a perimeter lockdown, and at least 2 of Carlo Ortega's men who are unaccounted for and whose last known position was moving toward the vestibule. I know. If Ortega's men see you, I know." She didn't slow down. "You've been watching this building for 6 days. Tell me where Ortega's men came in from and where their vehicles are." A pause. Then, "South lot. 3 vehicles. 2 of his men came in with the catering staff. One was placed as a florist assistant yesterday morning." The florist assistant. Where was his last position? "Near the east side door. That was 4 minutes ago." "And the east side door leads to building maintenance yard, connects to the south lot through a locked gate." Another pause. "The gate key is on the same ring as the closet key you're still holding." She looked down at the key in her hand. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at the man who had been waiting in the maintenance corridor with a taped key and information that could only have come from weeks of detailed preparation and access to surveillance she hadn't known existed. "You built a parallel architecture," she said. He met her eyes. "We've been in position to support this operation for 8 months. Before I activated anything. Before you activated anything. Which means you've been watching me build this for almost a year, and you never made contact until I was already in the building. Contact carried risk of exposure. We assessed the risk and determined—" "You used me," she said, not loudly, with the specific flat precision of a person who has just correctly identified the load-bearing element of a structure and is holding it up to the light. "My cascade drew everything into the open. The federal response, the rival family response, all of it. You needed something to detonate it. I was the detonator." The man in the corridor looked at her without flinching. "You were also the only person in the world with both the access and the motivation to build what you built. Those 2 things don't cancel each other out." "They don't." She turned back toward the closet door. "But they change what happens next." She pushed through the door into the vestibule closet, through the outer door into the vestibule itself, and immediately felt the change in atmosphere. The cathedral behind the closed interior doors was audibly organized now. The chaos resolved into something more directed, which meant the federal command structure had established itself and was processing the scene systematically. Which meant her father was sitting in a pew somewhere being told to remain calm by a federal agent who had a specific file with his name on it. She moved along the vestibule wall to the east side door, unlocked it with the second key on the ring, opened it 4 inches and looked through. The maintenance yard was empty except for a delivery van with a florist company logo on the side, and a man in a gray jacket standing near the gate to the south lot with his back to her. Ortega's man, the one placed as the florist assistant, now positioned where he could watch both the gate and anyone coming through the east door. Vivienne looked at him for 3 seconds. She was in a white wedding gown. The idea of moving through this yard without being seen was not available to her. She heard footsteps behind her, the man from the corridor. "There's a catering coat in the van," he said quietly. "Unlocked. Driver left the key in it. White. White. Not ideal, but it's better than the dress." She did not have time for this to be as absurd as it was. She pushed the door open fully, stepped into the yard, and moved toward the van with the specific purposeful stride that she had learned meant people looked past you rather than at you. Not running, not hiding, just moving with the body language of someone who belongs exactly where they are. Ortega's man at the gate turned his head. He looked at her. She did not look at him. She reached the van, opened the back, found the coat, white cotton, catering issue, too large, and put it on over the gown in the specific sequence of movements she'd seen her paralegal use to pull on a raincoat while holding coffee without spilling any. The man at the gate was still looking. She turned and faced him. His hand moved toward his jacket. From somewhere behind him through the gate came the sound of vehicles. Federal vehicles, the specific engine register of large SUVs driven with deliberate speed. The man at the gate looked away from her for exactly 1 second, checking the sound, performing the instinctive threat recalculation that his position required. She was already at the gate. She unlocked it with the 3rd key on the ring, and this was the moment she understood the full scope of what the man in the corridor had prepared, because the gate opened silently, which meant someone had oiled the hinges recently, which meant the parallel architecture extended to physical preparation of the site in specific ways, and the depth of it was something she was going to have to sit with later when she had the luxury of being somewhere that wasn't about to be sealed. She pushed through the gate into the south lot. Ortega's man was 3 steps behind her, and his hand was out of his jacket now, and she turned to face him and said, clearly and without raising her voice, "Carlo Ortega's accounts are on those screens. In the next 10 minutes, he's going to be running the same calculation you are right now. When he finishes, he's going to want to talk to me. Not to you. To me. And if I'm not available because you made a decision he didn't authorize, you're going to have to explain that to him." The man stopped. He was looking at her with the focused, assessing expression of someone who has just received information that disrupts a clear instruction and is trying to determine whether the disruption is real or a manipulation. She looked back at him with absolutely nothing on her face. He lowered his hand. She turned and walked across the south lot toward the far corner where 2 of the 3 Ortega vehicles were parked, and she pulled out her phone and called her father's cell number and listened to it ring once, twice, and then her father's voice, tight and controlled in a way she had only heard from him 3 times in her life, said, "Vivian, where are you?" "Outside, south lot. Listen to me very carefully." She kept moving. "There are 2 federal agents in that building who have documentation about the 2021 offshore transfers. Don't say anything to anyone. Say you've contacted your attorney and you'll cooperate fully in coordination with legal counsel." A silence that lasted less than 2 seconds. Then, "How do you know about Dad?" She put into that single word everything she had. The full weight of who she was to him and who he was to her, and the 20-some years of a relationship that had been complicated and demanding and real in ways that most of what she'd experienced in this building today had not been real. "Not now, just do what I said." Another silence. "Okay," he said. "Vivian, I know." She meant it in every direction it could be meant. "I'll call you in 20 minutes. She ended the call. The man from the maintenance corridor appeared at the gate behind her. He was moving with the same unhurried, deliberate pace he'd had in the corridor, which communicated either extraordinary calm or professional training or both. He crossed the lot and fell into step beside her without being asked. "There's a vehicle at the lot's northeast corner," he said. "Dark blue sedan, it's ours. And if I get into that vehicle," she said, "I'm going somewhere your people have chosen, to be debriefed by people I've never met, about an operation that you've just told me I was partially functioning as an unwitting component of." "Yes." "And the alternative?" "The alternative is that you navigate the next 4 hours without the information we have, in a city where Lucien's remaining organization, the parts that weren't covered by your cascade, are now operating with the specific knowledge that you're the person who detonated it, and where Carlo Ortega's people know your face and know you were at this event and are currently uncertain whether you're an asset or a liability." She walked 3 more steps. The catering coat was too large and the wedding gown beneath it was pulling at her ankles, and somewhere inside the cathedral behind her, the most significant operation she had ever built was being processed by federal agents who were going to have questions she needed to answer carefully and strategically, but not yet. Not until she understood the full shape of what had gone wrong with the Frankfurt and Singapore piece and what Webb's interception had actually compromised. She stopped at the dark blue sedan, looked at it, looked back at the man. "I want everything you have on Marcus Webb," she said, "unredacted, in the vehicle. Some of it is classified. Then we have a problem," she said, "because I'm not getting into that car without it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he believed he had modeled accurately. Then he took out his own phone and made a call and said 3 words she didn't catch, and by the time he ended it, she could see a second person approaching the sedan from the far end of the lot, a woman, mid-30s, carrying a tablet. The woman reached the car, unlocked it, placed the tablet on the back seat with a specific screen open that Vivian could see from where she stood, contained a file with Marcus Webb's name at the top and a classification marker that had been partially obscured by a diagonal red stripe. Partially, not fully, which meant either they were showing her good faith or they were showing her exactly what they wanted her to see, and she was going to have to read it fast enough and carefully enough to tell the difference. She got into the car. The door closed. The tablet screen filled her field of vision, and she started reading. And within 90 seconds, she understood that everything she thought she had understood about Marcus Webb, about the shape of the operation she'd run, about who had been watching her and for how long and with what intentions, every assumption she had made and trusted, was not simply wrong. It was the precise inverse of the truth. And the woman who had spent a year building the perfect weapon to destroy one man had just discovered, in the back of a sedan in a cathedral parking lot, that she had been building it for someone else entirely. The tablet screen was bright in the dim interior of the sedan, and Vivian read the way she always read critical documents, fast on the first pass for structure, slow on the second pass for detail, and a third pass for what was missing, because what was missing from a document was always at least as important as what was in it. Marcus Webb's file had the structure of a man's professional life rendered in bureaucratic language: dates, positions, institutional affiliations, transaction records. She moved through it quickly. Mid-level compliance officer, 15 years at Hartley Partners, clean record, 2 commendations, 1 formal reprimand in 2019 for a procedural violation that had been quietly resolved. On the surface, exactly what he had appeared to be. The second pass was where it changed. The classification stripe that had been partially obscured covered a section in the middle of the file, a surveillance log. She could see the format even through the redaction, the columns for date and subject and observer. What was visible above and below the stripe told her the log covered a period beginning 22 months ago, which was 4 months before Marcus Webb had approached her at the conference. She looked up from the tablet. The man from the corridor. She still didn't have his name. She cataloged that as an operational detail she would address shortly, was in the front passenger seat. The woman with the tablet was driving. Neither of them was looking at her. The surveillance log in the middle of this file, she said. The redacted section. What does it show? It shows the period during which Webb was operating under direction. Direction from whom? The man in the front seat turned his head slightly, not enough to make eye contact. That's the part that's going to require some context. I don't want context, I want the name. A pause that had weight in it. The sedan was moving now. She hadn't noticed the moment it started moving, which told her something about the state of her focus. They were heading north on a street she recognized as running parallel to the cathedral block. The direction came from within the organization we work for, the man said. The air in the car changed. She felt it in her chest before she processed it cognitively. The specific physical response to a threat that is closer than you calculated. The body's faster than thought recalibration of the distance between itself and danger. Webb was your asset, she said. Webb was our asset, yes. And you placed him in my path. We identified him as a potential vector for establishing contact with you in a way that would appear organic. Yes. She looked at the back of his head. She was gripping the tablet hard enough that the casing was pressing into her palm, and she made herself loosen her fingers. You've been running me, she said, from the beginning. We've been... He stopped. Started again. With the careful precision of a man who has decided that the word he was going to use is wrong and is choosing a different one. We identified your potential 18 months ago. We assessed that you had both the access and the capability to build what you built. We created conditions that supported your investigation without directing it. Marcus Webb came to me with documents, she said. Hartley Partners' internal documents showing 3 years of Moretti transaction records moving through legitimate accounts. Those documents gave me the framework for the entire financial section of the cascade. Yes. Were those documents real? The pause this time was shorter, which was worse. They were real documents. The transactions they showed were real. Another pause. The framing around them. The specific way in which they were presented to you, the emphasis on certain accounts over others, that was curated. She sat with that word. Curated. You needed specific accounts included in the cascade, she said. Accounts that wouldn't have been my priority if I'd been working from raw data. The Frankfurt and Singapore accounts were the primary targets of this operation, yes. They represent the financial architecture connecting the Moretti organization to 3 other networks operating across 11 countries. Your domestic cascade was significant. It was also, for our purposes, secondary. The interception, she said. Webb intercepting the Frankfurt and Singapore packages. Was not a defection. He received an instruction to intercept from our side. Everything in the car was very quiet. She heard her own heartbeat. She heard the tires on asphalt. She heard the specific silence of two people in the front seat who were not looking at her because looking at her would require acknowledging what they were seeing. "You pulled the primary targets out of my cascade," she said, slowly, like someone walking across ice and testing each step. "You let the domestic packages release, the federal investigation, the news organizations, the rival family exposure, and you pulled the international piece. The timing wasn't right for the international piece. There are operations running in Frankfurt and Singapore that would have been compromised by an early exposure. The accounts needed to remain active for—" "How long?" she said. "Vivian, how long did you need those accounts to stay open?" The man finally turned to look at her fully. His face in the sedan's interior light had the expression of someone who has reached the moment they prepared for and is finding it worse than anticipated. 60 days. 60 days, she repeated. The Singapore operation closes in. In 60 days, she said, Lucien Moretti's lawyers will have processed the domestic federal charges, identified every piece of documentation in the cascade, and will have begun negotiating the cooperative disclosure deal that implicates my father. In 60 days, Elliot Ashcroft will have been publicly connected to financial crimes that he did not knowingly participate in, and the narrative will already be formed in the media, and the legal cost of unwinding it will be— She stopped. You know exactly what the cost will be. That's why you needed me to activate the cascade first. You needed the domestic detonation to create cover for whatever you're doing in Singapore. And you needed my father's exposure as a bargaining chip to ensure that I would cooperate with whatever comes next. The man in the front seat said nothing. She looked at the woman driving. The woman was watching the road with the committed focus of someone who has decided that the road is the only thing she is responsible for. Stop the car, Vivian said. We can't stop here. We need to reach a secure— Stop the car. She said it the second time with something different in it. Not louder, but denser. The specific frequency of a person who has passed the point where social compliance has any purchase on their behavior. Right now. Or I open this door while we're moving and we all have a very different problem. The woman driving glanced in the rearview mirror. Something passed between her and the man in the passenger seat in the compressed language of people who communicate under operational protocols. The car stopped. They were on a side street, commercial, largely empty at this hour on a Saturday, a restaurant supply store, a parking structure, the ordinary texture of a city block that had no idea what was in this car. Vivian looked at the man. Who do you work for? Actual name, actual organization, right now. I can't give you that information and then we're done. She put her hand on the door handle. Mallory Group, the woman driving said. The man turned toward the front sharply. Reyes? She's going to find out in the next 30 minutes regardless. The woman named Reyes kept her eyes forward. And she's right about her father. We should have told her about the 60-day window before she activated. Vivian knew the name Mallory Group the way she knew most things. From a reference in a document she'd handled peripherally 2 years ago, a financial due diligence file for a client that had turned out to have connections she hadn't fully explored. Private intelligence. Corporate level. The kind of organization that operated in the space between governments and markets and had clients in both without advertising either. You work for someone who has financial interests in the Singapore accounts, she said. We work for someone who has operational interests in the networks those accounts connect to, Reyes said. It's not the same thing. It's close enough. Vivian opened the door. She was out of the sedan before either of them could respond, the catering coat flaring around her, the wedding gown pooling slightly at her ankles on the asphalt, and she walked 4 steps away from the car and stood on the sidewalk of an ordinary commercial block in the middle of what was either the most significant morning of her life or the most catastrophic, and took 3 slow, deliberate breaths. Her phone showed 11 missed calls, her father's number 3 times, Dara twice, numbers she didn't recognize 6 times. She called her father back. He picked up on the first ring. Vivian, there are agents. They're saying I need to come with them for questioning. Don't go voluntarily. Tell them your attorney will arrange a formal interview within 24 hours. Use Marcus Webb's name when you talk to them. A silence. Why would I use? Because Marcus Webb is the person who curated the documents that implicated you in those 2021 transactions. He's an asset of an organization called the Mallory Group, And the framing of your involvement was deliberate, and we're going to be able to demonstrate that. She was speaking faster than she normally did, the cadence driven by the specific pressure of needing to move 3 parallel tracks of information simultaneously. But I need 30 minutes. Can you give me 30 minutes? Vivian, what is happening? Her father's voice had stripped down to something she hadn't heard from him since her mother's funeral. Unguarded, direct, genuinely asking rather than assessing. I'll explain everything, she said. 30 minutes. Don't speak to the agents without counsel. She ended the call and turned around. The man from the corridor, she needed his name. She needed it now. Unnamed people were operationally incomplete. Was standing outside the sedan 3 feet from her. Reyes had not gotten out. Your name, Vivian said. A pause. Then, Carver. Carver. She looked at him. The 60-day window is not acceptable. The operation in Singapore is not my problem. She took 1 step toward him. You used me to build a detonator for your operation. That detonator has exposed my father to a federal investigation based on framing that your organization created through your asset. You're going to fix that in the next 4 hours, or I'm going to take everything I know about the Mallory Group and the Singapore operation, and I'm going to give it to the same federal agents who are currently processing the Moretti crime scene, and your 60-day window becomes approximately 60 seconds. Mia-san. Carver looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just reassessed something significant. You don't have anything on Singapore, he said. We were careful. You were careful about what I could see in Webb's file. She held his gaze. You weren't careful about what I could infer from the structure of what was redacted, and the specific accounts that were pulled from my cascade, and the timeline of your organization's engagement with Webb, and 2 other things that I'm not going to tell you because they're leverage and I intend to keep them. She let a moment pass. I've been building financial architecture and identifying what's hidden inside it for 9 years. You are not the first person to put a redacted document in front of me and think that was adequate. Carver was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted them. What do you want? He said. I want the documentation that proves Webb's framing of the 2021 transactions was manufactured. I want it in a format that can be submitted to the federal investigation. I want it in the next... She checked her phone. 2 hours. That documentation contains material that identifies... I don't care what it contains. I want what protects my father. You figure out how to produce it without burning whatever you're protecting. That's your problem. You have 2 hours. She turned away from him and started walking. Where are you going? He said behind her. Back, she said without turning around. Back where? The federal agents at the cathedral will detain you for questioning the moment you appear. Lucien's remaining people are looking for you. Ortega's men are... I know. She kept walking. I'm going back to get ahead of it. She heard him take 2 steps after her, and then stop. She didn't look back. She walked to the corner and turned it and came out onto the main avenue running south toward the cathedral block. And she pulled off the catering coat as she walked and left it on the sidewalk. And the wedding gown in the morning light was extraordinary and conspicuous and impossible to miss. And she decided that this was exactly correct, because the last place anyone would expect to find the woman who had just destroyed an empire from the inside was walking back toward the wreckage, wearing the dress she'd worn to burn it down. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go, then picked it up. This is Vivian Ashcroft. I know who it is. The voice was older, male, accented in the specific way of a man who learned English as a second language in his 20s and had spent the intervening decades mostly in rooms where other languages were spoken. Carlo Ortega. She recognized the voice from the cathedral, from the 2 seconds of clarity in the chaos when he'd said Lucien's name like a verdict. You did something today that I have been waiting a long time to see done. She kept walking. Mr. Ortega, the accounts on those screens, those were mine. I know. Lucien has been moving money through structures he told me were secure, structures he controlled but told me were shared administration. I know that too. A pause. How long? 3 years at minimum? Possibly 4? The documentation goes back to 2021, but the structural setup predates the first transaction I found records for. She was at the corner of the cathedral block now. She could see the federal vehicles from here. 4 large, dark SUVs positioned at the main entrance, uniformed officers at the perimeter, and the specific organized movement of a scene in the process of being locked down and processed. "Mr. Ortega, I don't have a lot of time right now." "No. Neither do I." His voice had the weight of a man making a decision in real time. "The woman who built what you built today is someone I want to talk to. Not today. Soon. I'm not available for the kind of conversations your organization typically has. I'm aware of that." Something that might have been amusement in his voice, dry and minimal. "What I want to discuss is cooperation with the federal investigation. Specifically, certain information that I have about Lucy Yen's operation that would be useful to the people processing this case. Information that I would prefer to provide through a conduit who has already established a relationship of trust with the relevant investigators." She stopped walking. This was not a variable she had modeled. Carlo Ortega, head of the Ortega family, one of the 3 most powerful organized crime figures in the northeastern United States, was suggesting that he wanted to cooperate with a federal investigation. Through her. Which meant he wanted the legal protection that cooperation could provide. Which meant he was scared. Not of the federal agents, of something else. Something the documents on those screens had revealed about his own exposure that went beyond what Lucien had done to his accounts. "You're in the Frankfurt documents," she said. It was a guess built on inference, and she delivered it with the flatness of a certainty to see what it hit. A silence that told her she had hit something. "We should meet," he said. "I'll call you," she said, "after I've talked to the federal agents." She ended the call and put the phone in the one pocket the wedding gown had, a small, internal pocket that the designer had included because Vivian had specifically requested it during the fittings, which now struck her as either excellent foresight or the saddest possible application of practical thinking. She walked the remaining half-block to the cathedral perimeter. A uniformed officer saw her coming and moved to intercept, one hand raised, and she stopped in front of him with the full composed authority of a woman who had not been running from anything and did not intend to. "I'm Vivian Ashcroft," she said. "I'm the person who initiated the complaint that precipitated this investigation. I'm surrendering myself voluntarily for interview, and I'd like to speak with whoever is running the federal side of this operation. Now, if possible." The officer looked at her. The gown, the composed face, the absolute absence of anything that read as fear, and keyed his radio. Inside the cathedral perimeter, things were still moving. She could see through the main entrance that the interior had been reorganized, guests in sections, agents moving between them, equipment being brought in. She could see the projection screen still on, but displaying a static image she didn't recognize, something federal, some kind of holding display they'd switched to when they took control of the system. What she could not see, from where she was standing, was Lucien. She had not seen him since the moment in the cathedral when she'd watched his face change. She had not heard his voice since the sedan. She did not know, with any precision, where he was in the sequence of events. Arrested, in custody, still in the building, moved to a federal facility, or something else entirely that she hadn't accounted for. That absence of information was a problem she needed to resolve immediately, because everything she was about to do in the next 2 hours, the conversation with the federal investigators, the submission of Webb's framing documentation when Carver produced it, the conversation with Ortega that would need to be carefully shaped before it happened. Every piece of it was contingent on knowing exactly where Lucien Moretti was and what he was saying to whom. A second officer appeared and gestured for her to follow. She followed him through the perimeter, through the cathedral entrance, back into the building she had left 45 minutes ago, through a maintenance corridor and a key she'd found taped to a shelf. The interior was transformed. What had been spectacle was now procedure. The magnificent space reduced to a series of functional zones, evidence markers, interview clusters. The roses were still everywhere. Nobody had moved the roses. She was directed to a side room off the main nave, a small meeting space, plain, 2 chairs and a table, the universal architecture of a room designed for hard conversations. She sat in the chair facing the door and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall and waited. The door opened after 90 seconds. She had been expecting a federal agent. Protocol. Someone with a badge and a recorder and the careful procedural manner of an interview that was being documented. Instead, it was Lucien. He was not in handcuffs, he was not accompanied by agents. He was alone, and the tuxedo was different. The jacket was gone. The tie was gone. The white shirt was open at the collar, and there was a mark along his left jaw that would be a bruise by evening. He looked like a man who had come through something physical and had not quite finished processing it. He closed the door behind him. She did not move. She did not stand. She did not take her hands off the table. "How?" she said. "Cooperative disclosure," he said. "I gave them names they didn't have yet. It bought me 10 minutes. 10 minutes. She looked at him. "For what?" He pulled the second chair out and sat down across from her with the specific deliberateness of a man who wants to communicate that he is choosing to do this slowly, that this is not urgency, but intention. He put his own hands on the table, mirroring her without appearing to do it consciously. "Webb," he said. She held very still. "I know what Carver told you in the car." He watched her face. "I know about the Mallory Group. I know about Singapore." He paused. "I've known about Singapore for 8 months." The room felt very small. "You knew they were running an operation," she said. "I knew someone was building one. I didn't know you were the architecture." Something moved in his expression. Not regret, not guilt. Something more complicated and less categorizable. "When I found out, when Webb told me 6 weeks ago that the woman building the cascade was you, I sat with it for 3 days. And then you did nothing. And then I made a decision that I am now, in this room, aware was the wrong one." He held her gaze. "I decided that if you were good enough to build what you built, you were good enough to survive whatever came after. I decided not to warn you about Carver. Because warning me would have required telling me that Webb was your source, which would have told me you'd known about the cascade. Yes. Which would have changed everything. Yes." She breathed in, breathed out. "The Isabella video," she said. "The conversation I recorded. Was that real?" A silence that lasted exactly long enough to be its own answer, and then, "Yes." No qualification, no softening. Everything you heard through that door was real. She had known it was. She had known it the way you know things that you don't want to know. Not from evidence, but from the specific resonance of something that fits perfectly into a space you've been carefully not looking at. "Then why are you here?" she said. Lucien looked at her across the table in the small room with the roses still visible through the glass panel in the door, and he said, "Because Carver's organization doesn't intend to protect your father. The documentation he told you he'd produce, he can produce it. He's choosing not to. The 60-day window is real, but it's also a mechanism. If your father remains exposed for 60 days, the Mallory Group has leverage over you for the duration of their Singapore operation. That's the actual plan." She was very still. "And you know this because I have been in business with the Mallory Group for 4 years, Lucien said, "and leverage is the only currency they actually trade in." The door to the room opened. 2 federal agents stepped in, and behind them was a third person, not an agent. A woman in her 50s in a dark suit with the specific authority of someone operating at a level above the uniformed personnel, and she looked at Lucien with the expression of someone who had given him exactly the time she agreed to, and not 1 second more. She looked at Vivian. "Ms. Ashcroft," she said, "my name is Director Claire Voss. I think it's time all 3 of us had a very specific conversation about what the next 60 days are going to look like." And Vivian looked from Voss to Lucien and back to Voss, and she understood, with the complete cold clarity that had been with her since the moment she pressed her back against that door and raised her phone, that the plan she had built with such precision was not the plan anymore, that the ground had shifted in ways she had not designed for, and that the woman who had walked into this building this morning to execute a perfect strategy was going to have to do something she had spent her entire professional life training herself not to do. She was going to have to improvise. Director Claire Voss had the kind of stillness that comes from decades of sitting in rooms where the wrong word ends careers. She pulled out the chair at the head of the small table and sat in it with the unhurried precision of a woman who understood that the person who controls the room's tempo controls everything else. She placed a single manila folder on the table in front of her and left it closed. The 2 agents behind her positioned themselves at the door and became, with practiced efficiency, furniture. Vivian did not look at Lucien. She looked at Voss. "How long have you known about the Mallory Group's involvement?" Vivian said. Voss did not appear surprised by the question. 14 months. And you let them operate. We let them believe they were operating. Voss opened the folder. One sheet of paper, face down. She didn't turn it over. The Singapore network is the primary target of a joint operation involving 4 countries and 6 law enforcement agencies. Dismantling it requires timing that cannot be accelerated without destroying what we've built. That's the same thing Carver told me. Yes. The difference is that Carver told you that to buy compliance. I'm telling you because you've earned the actual explanation. Voss looked at her steadily. What you built this morning, the cascade, the documentation, the simultaneous multi-agency release, that was the finest single-operator intelligence action I have seen in 23 years of this work, and you did it as a private citizen with no institutional support. Vivian said nothing. The Mallory Group's plan to leverage your father's exposure was not sanctioned by this office, Voss continued. It was a freelance operation by Carver, designed to extend their control over the Singapore timeline. We were not aware of it until 40 minutes ago. How did you become aware of it 40 minutes ago? Voss glanced at Lucien for the first time. Vivian finally looked at him too. Lucien was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has made a calculation that cost him something significant and is sitting with the cost. The bruise along his jaw had darkened. His shirt, open at the collar, showed a second mark at the base of his throat. Not a bruise, a burn, the kind that comes from a weapon pressed close. Someone had put a gun to his throat in the cathedral before the federal agents established control, and she hadn't known it until this moment. He told you, Vivian said. He presented us with documentation of the Mallory Group's plan 48 minutes ago as part of his cooperative disclosure. Voss's voice was neutral. Not warm, not cold, factual. He also provided the contact chain between Carver and Webb going back 11 months, which fills a gap we've had in the Singapore timeline. Vivian looked at Lucien. Why? Lucien uncrossed his arms, put his hands on the table. He looked tired in a way she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled, deployed fatigue that powerful men sometimes use to communicate that they work harder than other people, but actual tiredness, the kind that lives behind the eyes. Because Carver's people were going to let your father take a federal charge for something he didn't fully understand he was involved in, he said, and I was the reason you didn't see it coming. The room was very quiet. That's not an answer, she said. That's a justification. It's both. He held her gaze. I knew about the Mallory Group's involvement with your cascade 6 weeks ago. I chose not to tell you. If I had told you, you would have restructured the operation, and the Mallory Group would have lost their detonator, and Carver would have had no reason to build the leverage play on your father. He paused. The exposure is my fault. Giving Voss the documentation was the only way I could correct it in the time available. She sat with that, the specific weight of it, the infuriating, complicated truth of a man who had deceived her in every meaningful way and had then, at the moment it cost him his primary legal leverage in a federal negotiation, used that leverage to protect someone she loved instead. She did not feel grateful. She felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been trying to solve a problem and has discovered that the problem contains a variable that refuses to behave like a variable. What does his cooperation actually give him? She said to Voss. Not to Lucien, to Voss. That's a conversation for his legal counsel and the Southern District. Give me the general shape. Voss looked at her for a moment, then said, cooperation of this magnitude. The Singapore chain documentation, the Mallory Group contact records, the additional financial architecture he's provided, creates a basis for sentencing considerations. Not immunity, not freedom, considerations. He's still going to prison. For a significant period, yes. Vivian nodded slowly. She looked back at Lucien. He was watching her with that expression she'd seen in the cathedral, the one she hadn't been prepared for, the recognition. It was still there. The things you said in the suite, she said, her voice was even, to Isabella. You were describing your plan for me. Yes, all of it. The political access, the Ashcroft capital structure, using me as cover for the offshore restructure. Yes. Did any part of the engagement mean something else? The question landed in the room and sat there. She had not planned to ask it. She had not planned to need to ask it. But she was sitting across a table from a man who was about to go away for years, and the architecture of the morning, the cascade, the car, the sedan, Carver, Voss, all of it, had stripped away every social and tactical layer between them, and underneath all of it was a question she had been not asking for 2 years. Lucian was quiet for a long time, long enough that one of the agents at the door shifted his weight. "I'm not going to tell you that I loved you," he said finally, "because the word is too small for what I'm trying to describe, and too large for what I actually did. What I did was choose. Over and over, for 14 months, I chose the plan over what I felt, and I chose to feel less so the plan would be easier. And I chose to tell Isabella what I said in that suite because saying it made the choice feel permanent in a way that made it easier to commit to." He stopped. "That doesn't absolve anything. I know what I did. I'm saying that the thing I was choosing against was real." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "It doesn't change anything." "No," he said, "it doesn't." Voss had been watching this exchange with the stillness of a person who has learned to treat the spaces between words as data. She did not appear uncomfortable. She appeared to be cataloging. "Miss Ashcroft," she said, "I have a proposal." Vivian turned back to her. "The documentation on Marcus Webb's manipulation of the 2021 transaction records has already been pulled from the Mallory Group's secure servers. It arrived in my office 17 minutes ago as a result of Mr. Moretti's cooperation." Voss turned over the single sheet of paper in the folder. It was a printed confirmation, file transfer, timestamp, receiving office. "Your father's exposure is neutralized. The Southern District investigators in the cathedral have already been informed." Vivian looked at the sheet. She absorbed what it meant. Her father. The 2021 transactions, the framing that Carver had built to ensure her compliance. Gone. Not in 2 hours. Already gone because Lucian had given Voss the Mallory Group's server access before she was ever in this room. "Carver," she said, "is being detained as of 12 minutes ago. His organization's activities in relation to this case are under investigation." Voss's voice remained factual. "The Mallory Group will not be operating freely for the foreseeable future." "And Singapore. The Singapore operation proceeds on its timeline. The Frankfurt and Singapore account documentation from your cascade has been secured by our international partners and will be activated at the appropriate moment." Voss folded her hands. 60 days, as Carver told you, but for the right reasons, and without leverage over you." Vivian sat back in her chair. She was aware, for the first time in several hours, of how her body felt. The specific accumulated weight of sustained adrenaline, the dull ache in her knees from the marble floor, the tension in her shoulders that had been there since 5 in the morning and had simply been irrelevant until now. The wedding gown was extraordinary and impossible, and she was deeply, profoundly tired of wearing it. "What's the proposal?" she said. "We want to work with you, Sheesh," Voss said. "Not as an asset, not as a source. As a consultant with full knowledge of operational context, on cases involving financial architecture of the kind you've demonstrated expertise in." She paused. "The Moretti case is one of 7 active investigations that have components your skill set would materially advance. We can offer institutional support, legal protection for your work, and access to information resources that would take you years to build independently." Vivian looked at the confirmation sheet, looked at the door, looked at Voss. "I'll need to review any engagement structure with my own counsel," she said. "I'll need full disclosure of existing Mallory Group entanglements in any case I'm asked to work on. And I'll need the web documentation in a form I can independently verify before I agree to anything." "Agreed," Voss said, with the ease of a person who has already decided those terms are acceptable. "And I need to speak with my father before I sign anything." "Of course." Voss stood. "Take whatever time you need. We'll be outside." She gestured to the agents, and they moved from the door, and Voss followed them, and the door closed, and Vivian was alone in the room with Lucien. She hadn't planned for this either. He hadn't moved. He was still at the table, in the same position, hands flat, watching her with the tiredness that was real. Outside the glass panel in the door, she could see agents moving, the organized aftermath of a very large operation, evidence being cataloged and people being processed, and the slow machinery of institutional consequence beginning its work. "Isabella," Vivian said. Not a question. just the name. She's in federal custody. She's been in federal custody since 9:47 this morning. She went with them without resistance. Lucian's voice was flat. Whatever he felt about that, he had already put it somewhere else. She isn't what you think. I know what she is. I know what she was to you. I was going to say she isn't going to cooperate. He paused. Whatever she told them about needing to think about it, she won't cooperate. That's not who she is. Vivienne looked at him. Is that admiration? It's accuracy. A beat. I know the difference. She stood up. The gown moved with her, heavy and white and entirely wrong for everything that had happened in it today. And she smoothed the front of it by reflex and then stopped, because smoothing it was absurd and they both knew it. The things you gave Voss, she said. The Mallory Group documentation, Webb's contact chain, Singapore. She met his eyes. You traded your primary legal leverage to protect my father. Yes. That's going to cost you years. Probably. Why? She said, and she meant it differently this time than when she'd asked it before. Not, why did you do it, but what do you want me to do with the fact that you did it? Lucian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the specific quality of a man who has run out of performance and is operating on something underneath it. Because you built something extraordinary, he said, and I spent 14 months trying to own it instead of respecting it. And the absolute minimum, that costs me is this. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she walked to the door, put her hand on it. Lucien. He looked up. Whatever time you serve, she said, use it. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by that when she started the sentence. By the end of it, she was. You're capable of things that are not this. You know that, and you've been choosing this instead for so long, you've forgotten you know it. He said nothing, but something in his face shifted. Not gratitude, not relief, something quieter and less comfortable than either of those. The specific expression of a person receiving something true that they haven't been given permission to receive before. She pushed the door open and walked out. Her father was in the main nave, seated in a pew near the center of the space, flanked by the focused quiet of a man who has been told not to speak and has spent the intervening time thinking with the focused intensity of someone recalculating everything. He looked up when she appeared and rose with a speed that surprised her. Not the careful, controlled movement of a man managing his public presentation, but something immediate and physical and not calculated at all. He crossed to her and stopped, and they stood facing each other in the middle of the cathedral among the roses and the evidence markers and the remains of the worst wedding in the history of this or possibly any building. And she saw in his face the things she had needed to see. That he understood now, or was beginning to understand, that his daughter had been carrying things he had not seen and had been capable of things he had not asked about and had walked into this building this morning knowing exactly what was going to happen and chosen to do it anyway. The federal agents, she said, they're going to release you. The 2021 documentation has been addressed. I know. One of them told me 10 minutes ago. His voice was thick in the way she had heard it twice in her life. Vivienne, He stopped, tried again. What you built to do what you did today. It wasn't just for you. No. He looked at her. But some of it was. She let out a breath she had been holding, it seemed, since approximately 5 in the morning. Some of it was, she said. He put his arms around her. He was not a demonstrative man. Had not been for 20 years since the death of her mother had reorganized him around a different structural principle, one that valued competence and presence over warmth. And the embrace was somewhat imprecise, the way physical affection is imprecise in people who have not practiced it often enough. It didn't matter. She stood inside it and felt the specific release of a muscle group she hadn't known was contracted. Dara appeared from the direction of the vestibule. She was still in her bridesmaid dress, which was deep blue, and had survived the morning in better condition than most things. She walked directly to Vivienne, looked at her from an operational distance of approximately 2 feet, and said, Do you have any idea how many times I called you? 11. 11 times, Vivienne. I know. I've been sitting in that room for... Dara stopped, looked at the cathedral, at the agents, at the evidence markers, at the roses, at Vivienne's father, at the wedding gown. Is it over? Most of it, Vivienne said. Most of it. Dara absorbed this. Okay. She looked at the gown. Can we at least find you something else to wear? It was such a small thing and so precisely the right thing that Vivian almost laughed. She didn't. There was too much between that impulse and its expression, but the corner of her mouth moved, and Dara saw it, and something in her exhaled. The three of them moved toward the side entrance. Agents noted their direction, and none of them intervened. Voss, visible across the nave in conversation with two other senior agents, glanced at Vivian and gave the smallest nod, the specific nod of a person who will need many hours of her time in the coming weeks and is content, for this particular moment, to let her leave. Outside, the June morning was still happening. The sun was at the angle it had been when the ceremony was supposed to begin, when 400 people had been rising from their seats, and the processional music was starting, and the world inside the cathedral had been, for approximately 45 seconds, exactly what Lucien had designed it to be. The city moved around the perimeter of the scene the way it always moved, with the vast indifference of a thing too large and too occupied with its own momentum to stop for anyone's catastrophe. Vivienne stood on the steps in the sun and felt it on her face. She thought about what Voss had proposed. She thought about the 7 cases. She thought about the financial architecture she could see in all of them, the way structures of concealment always followed certain patterns regardless of scale or geography, the way the people who built them always made the same category of error because human beings are pattern consistent in their deceptions in ways they are not consistent in much else. She thought about what it would mean to do this work with institutional support instead of alone, with access instead of inference, with the kind of legal protection that meant she could go as deep as the problem required without worrying about what came back at her. She thought about her father beside her, still recalibrating, still processing the morning with the slow, effortful honesty of a man who had been confronted with a version of his daughter he had failed to perceive and was now trying to understand where he had been looking instead. She thought about Dara, who had stayed in the room because she'd been asked to and had spent the morning alone with the knowledge that whatever was happening was large and dangerous, and had emerged from it with a question about what Vivian was going to wear, because that was how Dara handled things that were too large to process immediately. She found the smallest possible useful action and did it. She thought, briefly and without resolution, about Lucien. Not the Lucien in the suite, not the Lucien at the altar, not the Lucien in the small room with Voss. The Lucien who had said what I was choosing against was real with the specific delivery of a person reporting a fact rather than seeking absolution. She did not know what to do with that. She suspected she would not know what to do with it for a long time, and that this was acceptable, and that the not knowing was something she could carry without it becoming the center of gravity of everything else. She looked out at the street. The spectators who had been behind the rope barrier earlier were gone, dispersed by the police presence. But one person remained on the far sidewalk, a woman about her age, in ordinary clothes, holding a phone that she had apparently been using to film the scene. The woman's phone was pointed at the cathedral entrance, and then it found Vivian standing on the steps, and for a moment they looked at each other across the street through the camera's mediation. Vivian thought about the video going into the world. The woman in the wedding dress, standing in the sun, outside the ruin of something she had built and burned herself. She thought about what that image would become, what story it would be assembled into by the people who encountered it without context. She thought about how every story looked different depending on where you stood in relation to it and what you already believed about the people inside it. Then she stepped back from the threshold and let the door close between herself and the camera's line of sight. She did not need to be the image. She already knew what she was. She turned to her father. I need 2 hours. There's someone I need to speak with, and then I need to review the documentation from Voss before I agree to anything. Her father nodded. He started to say something, stopped, tried again. The accounts, he said. The 2021 transfers, I need to... You should have told me, she said, quietly, without accusation. Not because I would have judged you, because I could have helped you manage it cleanly, and instead I walked into 14 months of engagement with a man who had already found it. He absorbed that. Yes, he said, I should have. We'll deal with it properly, with counsel, not with exposure as the mechanism. She looked at him. That's not how we do things. It never should have been. He nodded again. Something in him settled, not into comfort, but into a more honest configuration than it had been before, the way a structure settles when you replace a compromised element with something load-bearing and true. Dara appeared with a jacket, her own, extracted from somewhere in the cathedral, presumably, and held it out. Vivian put it on over the wedding gown, and it was too small and blue and completely wrong and absolutely correct. They walked to the car. Her father's driver was waiting, having received some instruction at some point to relocate to the South Street, and he opened the door without comment in the professional manner of a man who understands that his job requires the suppression of every reaction that isn't relevant to the task of driving. Vivian got in, her father beside her, Dara in the front. The car moved. She watched the cathedral recede through the rear window. The federal vehicles still at the entrance. The agents still working. The roses still inside, white and enormous and unasked for, performing their function for an audience that had long since evacuated. She looked away before it disappeared entirely. She opened her phone. She had 47 notifications, which she would process in order of operational priority, beginning in approximately 90 minutes. She had a call to make to Carlo Ortega that required careful preparation. She had a response to compose to Voss regarding the consulting engagement terms. She had a conversation ahead with her father that would be long and difficult and necessary. She had work, real work, the kind that demanded the particular combination of intelligence and nerve and precision she had been building for 9 years without fully understanding what it was for. She had, against all reasonable expectation given what the morning had been, a future. She put the phone down. She looked out the window at the city moving past, the ordinary Saturday morning of it, the people on sidewalks, the light on the buildings, the enormous, indifferent, magnificent continuity of a place that did not stop for anyone's catastrophe and did not stop for anyone's survival either. At some point in the past few hours, without her having planned for it or built toward it, something had reorganized itself in the architecture of who she was. She could feel it the way you feel a structural change, not in any single element, but in the way the whole thing sits, the different distribution of weight, the new lines of load. She had walked into that cathedral carrying everything she had ever made of herself: the discipline, the precision, the controlled emotional economy, the structures within structures within structures. She had built them because they were necessary, and because they were what she was good at, and because the alternative was being the kind of person to whom things happened, rather than the kind of person who determined what happened. She had walked out carrying something different, not less. She had not simplified. She had not discovered that warmth is strength, or that vulnerability is power, or any of the other redemptive arithmetic that gets applied to women who have survived hard things as though survival requires a lesson to justify it. What she had was more accurate than that. She had learned that even the most precisely built architecture has load-bearing elements you didn't design. That the variables you dismiss as uncontrollable are sometimes the ones that matter most. That the gap between what you can plan for and what actually happens is not a flaw in your thinking. It is the space where the actual story lives. She had built a perfect structure, and the perfect structure had been used by people she hadn't accounted for and had collapsed in ways she hadn't designed. And in the collapse, it had accomplished something more complicated and more complete than what she intended. She could work with that. She already was. The car moved north through the city, and the morning opened around it, and Vivian Ashcroft sat in the back seat in her father's silence and her friend's careful presence, in a wedding gown and a borrowed jacket, and did not look back again. Some things, once done, do not require witnessing. They only require what comes next,